Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone, and
Bonjour à vous
welcome
tous et
to our
bienvenue
GAIA BFFP
à
Africa
notre
media
point presse
briefing
GAIA
for African
BFFP
journalists
Afrique pour les
in
journalistes
anticipation
africains
of
en
the resumed
prévision de
fifth
la
session of the
deuxième session
Intergovernmental
de
Negotiating
la cinquième
Committee,
réunion
or as we know it, the
du
INC
comité de négociation
5.2 of the
intergouvernementale,
Global
donc
Plastics Treaty.
l'INC 5.2,
I'm Nivian
sur le
Reddy,
traité mondial
Regional
sur les
Coordinator of the
plastiques. Donc cette
Movement in
session
Africa,
fera une
and it is
occasion
my
unique
pleasure to
d'explorer les
be
priorités
here
de
with
l'Afrique,
all of
de
you today.
discuter de l'impact
So,
régional du
while we wait
traité.
for
Nous
a
sommes
few more people to
ravis de vous
join
avoir
us,
tous ici
could you
aujourd'hui. Alors nous
please
allons
introduce
attendre que
yourself
tout le
in the
monde
chat? Which
arrive.
country,
Et en attendant,
organization,
nous
or
allons
media
vous
house that
demander
you
de
are
vous
from?
présenter dans le chat et nous dire qui vous êtes, de quelle organisation et quel pays vous êtes. Merci.
Great. As more people start coming in, welcome everyone.
Okay.
Great. Okay, so as we get into it a little bit, please note that you can also listen to today's session in French by choosing the interpretation option at the bottom. And if you are having any challenges, we do have team members on the call that'll help. Great. So next slide, please. And this is just the instruction in French as well. So, getting to today's session, we are very excited to have you all here with us. This session will provide us with a unique opportunity to explore Africa's priority and discuss the regional impact of the treaty, as well as connect with fellow media professionals covering this critical issue with us today. So, again, a huge welcome to all of you, and thank you for joining us. Please do introduce yourself in the chat. But before we get started, I think we want to just run through some housekeeping for the session today. So just a reminder to please display your full name on the Zoom account just to make sure that the people that have registered are the people that are actually joining the call. Um, we ask that you kindly keep all microphones on mute unless you are invited to ask a question live on the session today, just to avoid any disruption with the speakers here today. The chat function is going to be our go-to for Q&As. So please do use the chat function to send through any questions that you have for any of our speakers here today, and we will have an allocated slot to answer those questions live on the call. You can also, as most people are doing now, introducing themselves, but also just a space to share information and connect with each other via the chat. The session is being recorded in English and in French, so we will share the recording afterwards. And as I mentioned, we do have some team members on the call that can help you should you have any technical issues. So Marissa is on hand with us today to support on any tech needs. Okay, great. Now that we've run through some of the housekeeping matters, let's maybe start off just posing a question to our media colleagues here today. So we're going to get into a session with Marissa shortly, but before we do that, perhaps we could just open it up to our media colleagues that are here today. So if you could just share with us, from a media perspective, what are you most looking forward to at INC 5.2? So you can feel free to raise your hand and maybe we can just invite you to come in just to share some of your own feelings around this. So what are you most looking forward to at INC 5.2? No takers? Um, maybe I could just call on somebody. I see some familiar names. So Elvira, maybe I could just come to you. Is there anything that you're looking forward to from a media perspective at INC 5.2? And sorry for putting you on the spot. think we may have lost Elvira. Is there anyone that wants to have a go at it? If not, we can move forward. But during this call today, I think we will unpack a lot more things to look forward to. So, if there isn't something to look forward to by the end of the call, I'm pretty sure there's going to be quite a few things that will immediately come to mind. So, with that, perhaps I will get started with our first speaker for today. So, we're going to start off with a presentation by Marissa Naidu. So, Marissa is our plastics program manager and has been coordinating the Africa members for the Global Plastics Treaty process since the first INC way back in 2022, I believe. So, yeah, quite a long time. Um, so Marissa will be providing us with an overview of the Global Plastics Treaty and the current state of play of the negotiations, including some of Africa's key priorities heading into INC 5.2 this August. So Marissa, over to you.
Thank you so much, Niven. Just give me a few minutes to start up. Okay. All right. Thank you so much for the introduction. Good afternoon and good evening, everyone. It's great to see you here all in your numbers for this important session as we inch closer to the INC 5.2 in Geneva in a few days' time, actually. So we're all getting ready very much to enter that space. But maybe before I move along, can you all just confirm that you can hear me clearly? Someone can just confirm that for me.
Yep. All good.
Brilliant. So I'm really excited today to present to you around the Plastics Treaty and give you a few brief remarks on how this process has emerged and how it has come to be. And we're hoping that we can have a finalized treaty mandate at the end of this resumed fifth session, INC 5.2 in Geneva in August. So without further ado, I just want to briefly take you through where the current plastics crisis is right now at. And this may be old news for some of you. This may be a refresher for some of you. So just bear with me as we go through the basics first and then start getting into the real details of the Global Plastics Treaty. So as many of you may have seen, this report from the Global Plastics Policy Outlook Scenarios to 2060 that had presented what business as usual scenarios could look like if we continue producing plastic in the manner that we are right now. So the use of plastics could almost triple globally, and OECD countries are projected to double in their plastic use. Largest increases being expected for sub-Saharan Africa and Asia. And we have gathered here today as African civil society and African journalists for one reason and one reason only, and that is to report in the most effective and in the most accurate manner around this plastics crisis problem that we have on our hands. So it's very important for us to realize and recognize what the scenario and what the situation could be like come 2060 or even a few years down the line. We're already seeing the magnitude of this crisis permeating across our communities, across fence line communities, and even, when it comes to informal waste workers as well. And if we look at it, plastic waste is almost likely to triple by 2060, with half of all plastic waste still being landfilled and less than a fifth being recycled. And a lot of what we as citizens are accustomed to is finding plastic leaking into the environment. And that is what actually started the calls for a global plastics treaty. We could see the problem visible in our rivers, in our oceans, and in our communities and in the environment. And that's what has led to now having a treaty to be mandated across the full life cycle of plastics. So, as mentioned, we often recognize this problem as citizens or as consumers as being one that is downstream or one that is a waste management crisis. But very rarely do we recognize that this problem actually stems upstream, and it stems from the extraction of the fossil fuel industry, producing oil and gas and injecting that into the production of plastics. If we look at the statistics tell us that currently 6% of the total oil production is used by the plastic sector and will come to represent 20% by 2050. So that is where this crisis stems, and that is why it is so important that the Global Plastics Treaty recognizes and ensures that measures are taken at the upstream level. When we look at the entire plastics life cycle, as mentioned, it starts at the extraction all the way down to dumping and burning, which is the last phase. And most of plastic's worst impacts occur during the upstream phases, from extraction to plastic production, and then permeates down to dumping and burning, causing health issues across the entire life cycle, whereby we have the transfer of toxic compounds into food that happen in the use phase, while non-recyclability of most plastics happens in the end-of-life issue and is an end-of-life issue, an end-of-life phase. So to acknowledge this, and to recognize that Africa has not been alone in this crisis. But as Africa, we've come out as leaders in addressing or trying to address the plastics pollution crisis. We have, out of 54 African states, 34 have either passed a law banning plastics or implemented it, or have passed a law with the intention of implementation. But without global measures and global standards in place, these policies and these laws at a national level fall short from real implementation and seeing the real light of being executed in the most effective way possible. And is further compounded in Africa. We often see in countries like Kenya and in Ghana, especially, illicit waste trade happening, the dumping of textile waste and e-waste coming from global north countries. We often see little to no incentives for alternate delivery systems like reuse and refill on the African continent. And we're also now seeing intensive lobbying by the powerful private sector. And this is something that has made its way into the plastics treaty negotiations as well. The conflict of interest narrative that we see in multilateral environmental agreements is something that is hindering this process and proving to be, stalling progress, if I can say the least. So here's what you need to know about the Global Plastics Treaty, and here's how this plastics treaty can help solve the plastics pollution problem. So the Plastics Treaty has been an acknowledgement by governments that plastic pollution knows no borders, and therefore global coordinated action is needed. Given the failure of several voluntary initiatives and the severity of the plastic pollution crisis, the time could have not been more ripe for a plastics treaty. And if I were to just take you through the journey of how this treaty has come up and come about as we enter what could be the final round of negotiations. This treaty has been in the making for the past 5 years, since 2014, during the United Nations Environment Assembly, UNEA 1, right up until UNEA 5. But it is important to note that since UNEA 1, we've been discussing this issue as a marine litter only problem. And it was only up until 2022 when a landmark resolution to adopt a plastics treaty was actually passed to end plastic pollution across its full life cycle that includes all plastics and all associated pollution with no exceptions. And that's what makes this treaty so unique. It is a treaty that has now finally recognized that plastic is not just a waste management problem. It is a problem that stems upstream and a problem that needs to be, tackled at the source. So this is the monumentous moment that took place in 2022. On the 2nd of March 2022, the United Nations Environment Programme announced the adoption of the world's first global plastics treaty. And why is this treaty so important? As I've mentioned, it has been something that has been designated within the United Nations Environment Assembly that got us the unanimous resolution, Resolution 5.14. So I'm just refreshing all of your minds as to how we've now come to what would be almost the sixth round of negotiations. Why does this treaty matter so much? The Plastics Treaty will be the first opportunity in history to address what national regulations could not for the longest time, such as global plastic production, global plastic pollution, and global finance to tackle plastic pollution. It will be a global avenue to unlock systemic change away from plastics, both at pace and at scale. A strong treaty could push the entire petrochemical, plastic, and fast-moving consumer goods companies and industry to shift towards reuse and environmentally sound design. Finally, it has the power to hold all signing countries to a high common minimum standard of action, and that is what makes this treaty so vital. If we were to journey across all of the negotiations so far, very briefly, if we look at what happened during INC-1, which was the first round of negotiations that took place in November 2022, this round of negotiations helped countries to discuss procedure. It helped them also cement their national interventions and how they would like to tackle this issue from a national commitment perspective. And all of that culminated into an options paper. So we've had several versions of a treaty text so far from INC-1 right up until INC-5.1. And during INC-2, this is when we faced the most difficulty, when we had a small group of countries trying to hold this process to what is called the consensus versus voting deadlock. And that's where the process sort of got locked in this ideology that we can only make decisions via consensus, which is not true. So that led to a zero draft text being produced, the negotiations during INC-2, and during INC-3, which took place on home soil here in Nairobi, in Kenya, that is when member states started discussing the zero draft. And unfortunately, that led to an entire ballooning of text, which was then called the revised zero draft. There was also no option for intersessional work during that particular INC. At the fourth round of negotiations in Ottawa, Canada, this is when the negotiations started to lead to a lengthy compilation text, and where we finally got a mandate to have intersessional work and begin really working on text. It also gave way for the chair of the INC to basically start making his own proposals, non-paper proposals for what the treaty measures could look like and what the treaty text could look like. And then we now have INC 5.1, which took place most recently in Busan. And this was when the INC was actually suspended. It ended off with the chair's text, which would now go into the next round of negotiations and form the starting point at INC 5.2. But what was so different from all of the INCs at INC 5.1 was that we saw a progressive majority of countries demonstrating ambition and trying to hold the line when it comes to what an ambitious treaty should look like. And at INC 5.1, we won all that could have been won. Now, when I say we won all that could have been won, we had the political dynamics play out, and that turned out to be a success. We had the narratives playing out on some of the strongest measures in the Plastics Treaty, but more importantly, we had the numbers and we had the alliances. We had coalition of countries supporting progressive text at INC 5.1. But what we failed to achieve at INC 5.1 and what we're hoping can be achieved at INC 5.2 is that all of that ambition in declarations translates into wins that the treaty text can be proud of. So that is what the focus would be. And if I were to answer the question as to where are we right now in this moment in time, At this moment in time, we're about to head into Geneva between the 5th to the 14th of August for the resumed 5th session. We will go in taking the chair's text, which has culminated under informal negotiations. It has culminated from country coalition proposals, but we also need to be very mindful that this text also culminated under undue conflict of interest. We see right now petrochemical states, as well as plastic producing countries and companies infiltrating the text in some way or the other. And it can be evidenced by weaker options that the chair's text currently has. And all of that needs to be reduced so that we can bring out the most strongest treaty options possible for an effective one. So this is where things lie at the moment. We have two blocks of countries right now, a progressive majority states of countries where 100+ countries have called for measures to bring primary plastic production in line with the climate planetary limit of 1.5 degrees, respecting the UNEA Resolution 514 mandate. We have 100+ countries also supporting binding product and chemical phase-outs to end plastic pollution. And we have over 151 countries supporting a financial mechanism with a dedicated fund. And we have Africa to thank for that, because the African group of negotiators have been instrumental in calling for a dedicated fund and in gaining support for a dedicated fund to implement the treaty's measures. But on the other hand, we have a small minority group of countries that have been trying to push this process to focus on waste management and false solutions. They have been actively rejecting production caps and the listing of chemicals in plastics. They have tried to limit the scope of the plastic's life cycle to start at design. They have tried to weaponize the right to development and vested petrochemical and economic interests, and they are currently holding this process hostage by calling for a consensus-only decision-making procedure. And what that means is that they're basically saying is that nothing is agreed until everything is agreed and until everyone agrees to it. So that is where we find ourselves in this moment in time. And to reflect a little bit on how Africa has progressed in these last couple of weeks. So we had the heads of delegation meeting, which took place, all of these meetings took place in Nairobi over the last month or so. Between the 30th of June and the 2nd of July, heads of delegation and member states met in Nairobi for an informal meeting to try and make progress before entering the INC 5.2. However, during this meeting, member states continued to be entrenched in their national proposals and positions. However, there was some progress that was made during this meeting, whereby member states brought forward bridging proposals as well to try and gain traction and to try and ensure that, we were trying to go into INC 5.2 with our best foot forward. And then we had the African Group of Negotiators Regional Consultation Meeting, which took place from the 3rd to the 5th of July. And what is important to note is that the African Group of Negotiators, or the AGN as we like to call them, continue to remain committed to an ambitious treaty, specifically on dedicated finance, specifically on a mandatory provision for just transition, and exclusion of waste to energy and fault solution. They also remain steadfast on addressing chemicals of concern and sustainable production and consumption. And then most recently that took place was the AMCEN 20 from the 14th to the 18th of July in Nairobi. AMCEN 20 saw a new light. It was a reaffirmation of the AMCEN Decision 19/2, which continues to remain as the Northern Star that guides Africa's negotiating position. And at this stage, I want to address all of you here in the room around the AMCEN decision. Now, the AMCEN decision is a very important decision. It is one that allows for our African negotiators to continue to uphold their ambition, specifically the AMCEN decision 19/2. It is with this decision that safeguards Africa's priorities for the treaty. And we have to, in reporting around the treaty and in reporting around Africa's positions around the treaty, we have to hold them to account that this decision was given as a mandate by African ministers and should continue, to proceed with ambition in the treaty process. So to very quickly touch around where AMCEN comes from, AMCEN is basically the African Ministerial Conference on the Environment, and it brings together African ministers and key stakeholders periodically every 2 years or so to discuss Africa's positions and participation in global policy processes, such as the Global Plastics Treaty, such as the UNFCCC or the Climate COPs, as well as the Convention on Biological Diversity. But it was only until the 17th session of AMCEN in November 2019 in Durban, South Africa, when ministers from the environment from Africa committed to addressing plastic pollution as a collective, joining voices of the European Union, the Pacific Islands, the Caribbean, and the Nordic Council of Ministers for a new global legally binding instrument to end plastic pollution. And it's since then that Africa has played a key role in the Global Plastics Treaty negotiations, beginning with the adoption of the AMCEN 19/2 decision. This was a landmark mandate and needs to be continued to be reaffirmed, repeated, and recognized where African ministers firmly established the continent's priorities. This decision commits the Africa region to advocate for a legally binding global plastics treaty that addresses plastic pollution across its entire life cycle, from production to disposal, while safeguarding human health and the environment. So, with that in mind, what should be our goal for INC 5.2? We need to secure a treaty package that is acceptable to a critical mass of countries without trying to seek impossible unanimity. Those that want to move forward should be allowed to move forward with us, and those that want to continue stalling, they need to take a back seat a little bit in this process and come on board when they are ready. We need a treaty that is effective enough to be worth funding and that reflects the priorities of a critical mass of countries. So I said over 100 plus countries and over 151 countries that demonstrated ambition. We need those countries to continue demonstrating that ambition at INC 5.2. So what would make for the ingredients of an effective treaty? The ingredients of an effective treaty right now, if we had to look at it in the form of measures and priorities, would be to reduce overall plastic production, to eliminate toxic chemicals from plastics, to scale up reuse and refill, to guarantee a mandatory just transition for waste workers and informal workers, to ensure that polluter and producers are held to account, and that there should be no loopholes that do no harm in the plastics treaty. So no reference to credits, no reference to polluting technology such as incineration and waste to energy. And we need for the treaty to establish a new dedicated fund, especially for developing countries and countries such as LDCs and SIDS countries. We also need to ensure that we have the right to vote. This is the only way to guarantee that countries can maintain their sovereignty and their ambition in this process. And whilst all of these measures are important, they can only be achieved if we strengthen countries by numbers, if we strengthen articles by association, and we do not give up on the integrity of the treaty text. We need all ministers on board to achieve these 8 key priorities, and we need all negotiators on board as well. And to briefly take you through what could possibly be the various pathways at INC 5.2. It is not going to be an easy journey, and there's going to be significant divergences again that will be brought forward by the small minority group of countries that will try and stall ambition and try and stall progress once again. But if we have an effective treaty, that is the most guaranteed pathway that we would be able to solve the plastics crisis. If we have a treaty that will focus only on waste management and it will be inequitable, that will reduce us down to the lowest common denominator. And that will be a treaty that will basically push for and strive for consensus-only decision-making. But there is an alternative pathway, and the alternative pathways could be a pathway that is taken through the coalition of the willing, where ambitious countries decide that they want to step this process outside of the UNEP auspices, or they decide that they want to take this process into the UN General Assembly or UNEA 7 for that matter. However, the first pathway to an effective treaty is very much still within our grasp, as long as we are able to keep the progressive majority progressive. So
just a few minutes left, Marissa.
Sure. Thanks, Niven. All right. So I think I've already touched on our priorities, the 8 priorities, but I'll very briefly go through why this is so important for Africa. As mentioned, our first priority is to ensure that the treaty covers the full life cycle. We recognize that as Africa and as a continent, the impacts and injustices of plastic pollution has affected us the most. And that is why we need this to be focused upstream and to ensure that Africa does not continue to remain as an extractive site for greedy petrochemical states and greedy petrochemical companies. And in terms of the second priority is to ensure that health, just transition, and human rights permeates across the treaty and is cross-cutting. This is not only an environmental treaty, it is also a health treaty. It is important to recognize that our health is exposed on a daily basis to the toxic impacts from plastics. The third priority is to ensure that we have a phase down of the problematic plastics, but to ensure that there's a strong provision on production, recognizing that Africa is not the biggest producer of plastics. We only produce 5% of the total world's plastics. So it should be relatively easy for us to uphold ambition in calling for an overall reduction of plastic production. When it comes to the fourth priority, eliminating toxic chemicals, it is important to recognize that we are one of the largest importers of plastics, and having transparent information and chemical disclosure of plastics is important for us to make informed decisions on what enters our African markets. The fifth priority for a strong, robust, dedicated fund is something that should not be a question on our minds. It should be as simple as the fact that we need the higher producing countries and higher income countries to actually commit to supporting this treaty financially. And if we look at mechanisms to hold polluters accountable, this can be achieved through mandatory EPR schemes as well as a polluter pays fee. And then seventh is scaling up reuse and refill systems and rejecting false solutions such as incineration that we keep seeing cropping up in our African communities from global north countries as well, trying to install or establish these obsolete, harmful practices that don't even work in their countries. We also need an effective decision-making process. This is the most sure way, the option to vote is the most sure way that we will be able to protect and safeguard Africa's ambition in this process. On that note, I want to thank you so much for listening to me, and I do apologize if I stepped a little over time. I just want to mention that we currently have a manifesto from civil society that includes signatories from Africa, and we've collected over 600 civil society signatories calling for an ambitious treaty, and this can be found at these various sites. There's also a press release available, and these slides will be shared with you post this meeting. So on that note, I would just like to say thank you and for your attention and for your patience, and happy to answer any questions further.
Thank you so much, Marissa, for grounding us in the conversation, as well as giving us the context and the overview for INC 5.2. Now, with that, we are well prepped on how we've got here. So I'm now thrilled to hand over to some of our African CSO leaders and spokespeople that will be attending INC 5.2 and have been champions in raising Africa's ambition for a strong plastics treaty. So I'm going to hand over to each of them to introduce themselves and speak very briefly just one key priority within the treaty that they are expecting African journalists to report on and cover at INC 5.2, and maybe a little bit about why this priority is so important to them nationally as well. So just an overview of our speakers that we're going to hear from. So we'll hear from Rico, who is from Groundwork in South Africa. We'll hear from Dorothy from Sejad in Kenya, Mohammed from Greenish in Egypt, Jacob from GAIA in Ghana. And we are also joined by a few other people. So we have Nadine from Sustainable Network Egypt, Sarah from Sradev in Nigeria, as well as Eskadar from Eco Justice Ethiopia. So I'm very, very excited to introduce all of them to you. And perhaps, Rico, I could hand it over to you as our first person, just a minute or two. Tell us a little bit about, what is the key priority from your perspective that you think needs better coverage from African journalists, and why is this so important to you? Rico, over to you.
Thanks, Naveen, and greetings to all of you. Thank you so much for being part of this process. It means a lot to us. One of the key reasons for that is because there is a dearth of information to the public to make informed decisions, and to also put the pressure necessary on our policymakers to make the right decisions. The key issue for us at Groundwork, we are Friends of the Earth in South Africa, and we've been working on chemicals for the last 25 years. And it is a massive problem in plastics that the chemicals that go into plastics to give it its property, so whether or not plastic is hard or soft, whether it's used, in a specific kind of industrial process, those plastics routinely have chemicals that are added to them. And the most recent scientific analysis undertaken by the Norwegian Science Academy has shown us that there are over 16,500 of these chemicals that are routinely added to plastic. But the most worrying factor about this is that less than 1% of those chemicals are controlled either by global agreements or are controlled by any national laws or kind of multilateral processes. So basically, the chemicals that we find in plastics are totally unregulated. When we look at that list of chemicals a little bit more closely, about a quarter of them are what are deemed as chemicals of concern. These are chemicals that can either cause cancers or adverse health impacts or adversely impact the environment. So basically, we have a plastics industry globally that is totally unregulated in terms of its production. And we see that in the context of waste. But even more importantly is the invisible hazard, the invisible dangers to public health. And that is the chemicals that are in those plastics. So for us to have a strong treaty, we have to regulate the chemicals that go into plastic. And more importantly, we have to have strong rules about disclosure, transparency of the information, so that we know what chemicals go into plastic. Because if we don't, when we do plastics recycling, we are recycling toxic chemicals into things like toys and that. And NGOs who have sampled toys in Africa have routinely found hazardous chemicals in toys. And these are toys that are made from recycling, and the chemicals in those toys, the toxins, have constantly been recycled. So that would be a massive priority area for us. And if anybody wants more information about this and links to the scientific reports and the synthesis of those scientific reports, just please get hold of us and we'll happily provide that information. Thanks, Naveen.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Rico, for sharing that priority of yours. And if anyone has questions for Marissa or Rico, please do put in your questions in the chat and we will get to them after we hear from all of our speakers. Next up, we're going to go to Mohammed. Mohammed, over to you.
Thank you very much, Niven, and thank you everyone for being here with us. I think for me, what's very important to communicate to the public is a lot of countries, especially countries in Africa, and some delegates are not actually fully aware of the scale of pollution we have in our own countries. And some of these countries are actually sometimes blocking the process. It would be great if there can be more media engagement in that regard, where we start to connect the pollution on the ground with how these countries are having their stances in the INC, to just show the stark difference and to show how important it is for them to try and bridge, even if there's some economic argument that they're trying to put forward, that at the same time, they need to actually take into consideration the scale of pollution and the scale of waste issues on the ground that their countries have not been able to resolve. And I think it would be great to focus here on obviously the African continent and specific countries across the African continent. One of the key things that we constantly hear is that if you improve your solid waste management, plastic pollution should be theoretically reduced. But we know from years of work that this is not enough, and that this does not solve the problem. And it hasn't solved the problem in other issues, not only plastic. So why would it work now? Usually, the only way to really solve issues that are associated with leakage and pollution is tackling the problem at its source, not tackling the problem at the end of its sort of life cycle. You need to start from the very beginning. And that requires us to really focus on production, sorry. So when looking at it from an encompassing view, that is really important, is to try in our coverage to connect the pollution on the ground to what the position of countries are trying to uphold. Africa is really trying to be very ambitious. A lot of African countries and negotiators are taking the lead to have some of the most ambitious positions across the negotiating table. But not all African countries are sort of convinced of certain aspects related to production. And probably this is where we can do more to communicate things with the public, to try and engage the public to get more opinions on having an ambitious plastic treaty and having a better position along the African group. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mohammed, for sharing that. Next up, we have Dorothy from Sejed in Kenya. Dorothy, over to you. And just noted on your hand, Elvira, we'll come to you once we open up for the Q&A session. Dorothy, over to you.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Hi, Niven. I think that to introduce myself, so I'm Dorothy Otieno, and I work in an organization called Center for Environment, Justice and Development, and we're based in Kenya. And for me, I think that the African reporters should follow and report on how toxic and hazardous chemicals are addressed in the ongoing treaty negotiations. And I'm picking up from where Rico has just left off. And I'm giving a context of what we are finding in Kenya. And it's because here we have conducted several studies in country, and we are finding that there's a lot of presence of toxic chemicals in everyday consumer plastic products, including children's toys and even kitchenware. So, you know, the way we cook with those black plastics, those contain toxic chemicals and they're leaching into our food, including food contact materials, packaging materials, all of that. Two, we've also conducted studies that have shown the presence of toxic chemicals in the food chain. And in that sense, it's that if these plastics that do contain chemicals, when they become waste, that translates into the environment and translates into the food chain. And that's to say that none of us is safe in that sense because we don't know where our food comes from. And in that way, we are all in danger and at risk of exposure to these chemicals. And lastly, which is our most recent study, is that we were conducting research, and we're looking at occupational exposure to toxic chemicals. And we found that in a group of people, that was waste pickers, waste recyclers, and a control group, which were people working in offices. And what we found is that all of these people are exposed to one of the chemicals called phthalates. So phthalates is not currently regulated under any global convention, which means we need the plastics treaty to address this chemical. And the concern should be that it's not only addressing this chemical in children toys, for example, it should be across all chemicals, because we are seeing it affecting everybody, regardless of whether you're coming into contact with waste or not. And so in that sense, we're seeing that nobody is safe. And concluding is just to say that therefore, we're calling a treaty to address these chemicals and others, and emphasizing on the need of transparency. Like Rico had also said before, it's to say that transparency is actually cheaper. If we're able to see the chemical formulation of a particular plastic, a country is able to make an informed decision without necessarily putting us through the process of testing of those chemicals, which is expensive. And we're having challenging discussions as to finance in these treaty negotiations. And so transparency becomes key for us, especially if we're looking at it from the context of financing. And I'll be happy to share any of these reports. And finally, it's to say that I believe that this treaty is an African treaty. And therefore, because Marisa had mentioned it before, we are a net importer of these chemicals, including in products, we will benefit from elimination of toxic chemicals in the plastics treaty. So thank you so much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Dorothy. And if anybody has any questions for Dorothy or Mohammed or Rico or Marissa, please do add in your questions in the chat. Next up, we're going to go to Jacob. Jacob is from Ghana. Jacob, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, colleagues, and thank you very much, Marissa, for that wonderful presentation. By way of introduction, my name is Jacob, and I work in Ghana for an organization called the Green Africa Youth Organization, and I am the Zero Waste Project Manager. What would like, particularly for journalists to cover for this round of negotiation, specifically on the issues that come around the dedicated multilateral fund that my colleague Marissa spoke about earlier. And for the fund, we know for a fact that many African countries are saddled with huge debts and would find it very difficult in order to cough up funds to be able to implement a treaty. So one of the key things would like very much for journalists, African journalists specifically, to cover during this particular round of negotiation is to ensure that a lot of the countries that can and should, because historically they have been, the big polluters that we've seen around, must be able to cough up funding to be able to establish a dedicated multilateral fund that would go towards the implementation of the treaty. And secondly, another big thing that would like for African journalists to cover is to ensure that we put a lot of pressure on our governments to push for the inclusion of a legally binding cap on plastic production globally. And because in the Ghanaian context, single-use plastics particularly, such as water packaging, carrier bags, plastic cutlery, and even food containers, make up a majority of the waste found in our drains, streets, markets, and in our landfills. And in Ghana, for example, over 1 million tons of plastic waste is generated annually, and less than 10% of that is recycled. So if you do the math, every year we have an accumulation of over 90% of waste in our environment. And that is very disheartening, because very soon our beaches are going to be taken over by plastics, and we'll be walking in plastics instead of sand. And so two major things that we'd like our African journalists particularly to cover is the inclusion of a globally legally binding cap on plastic production, specifically on single-use, avoidable, problematic plastics, and secondly, for the establishment of a dedicated multilateral fund to enable African countries to implement the treaty. Thank you very much, and back to you, Niven.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jacob. If you have questions for Jacob, please do put that in the chat. Next up, we have Sarah. Sarah, over to you.
All right, good day, everyone. I will start by introducing myself. My name is Sarah Onoa, and I am the Program and Logistics Manager for STRADEV Nigeria. STRADEV is an acronym for Sustainable Research and Action for Environmental Development. So basically, I will just start from where my colleague Jacob stopped, and also Mohammed really pick the point on the issues of what we need to report. We should know that plastic pollution generally is actually a problem for us and also affects public health and livelihood. And one of the things I want our media, the African media, to really concentrate on is plastic waste management, because from every other colleague that spoke on these issues, you should know that it is like a consistent thing. It keeps coming. Plastic waste management is all boiling down on plastic waste management in Africa. So, as the global treaty also aimed at reducing plastic production and also promoting circular economy. So I think I'm just putting this in the Nigerian context, because I just want, even though we know that most of the ones we work with are also hammering more on the issues of plastic waste management. How do we need to curb it? How we need to reduce production? And it is just a thing that has been discussed also in the global treaty, and it is like one of the major parts of African issues that have been discussed from the inception of the plastic treaty. So I want for us, Nigerian journalists should also have the need to speak and address the issues of environmental justice, calling out on technology transfer, even financial support, and also capacity building to help countries like us, which Nigeria, my own country, away from plastic without harming also our economy, and also something that cannot increase poverty one way or the other. So I want them to focus more on supporting the national efforts, and also in reduction of plastic production, and also plastic waste management issue. They should really hammer on these things and also report more on this, as it will not affect also public health and environment, including our economic development. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Next up, we have Nadine. Nadine, over to you.
Yes, hello. Thank you so much to the entire GAIA team for putting this wonderful event together, and Marissa for a great presentation. So my name is Nadine Wahab. I'm with Sustainable Network Egypt, and at this stage of the negotiations, I feel that we must prioritize effective, inclusive, and transparent decision making as part of the INC and future COPs. We need to restore trust in multilateralism. The INC must not fail into the traps we've seen, as Marissa mentioned, other environmental processes fall, particularly the climate negotiations, where procedural ambiguities and politicization have hindered ambition. Procedural clarity is not separate from substance. It enables it. A predictable, rule-based process and an effective decision-making mechanism, like voting, is essential in delivering an effective treaty. I wish to also underscore the critical importance of including voices from the ground in your coverage of the INC. Inclusion means including voices from the ground, particularly civil society researchers and frontline communities, not industry. We bring essential knowledge and implementation experience to the narrative. Many of us work on the ground where the impacts of plastic pollution are most deeply felt and have seen how it has negatively impacted our communities. This is a pivotal moment. If we get the treaty right, we may have a real chance at reducing plastic pollution. I just wanted to add one last thing that I had not prepared. All the speakers here really highlighted very key important points. Please do not forget that the process is just as important, and including our voices in coverage is just as vital. Thank you for your time.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Nadine. Our last speaker is Eskadar, but Eskadar could not join us today, but he did send through a recorded response. So we're going to just put that up right now to capture Eskadar's perspectives on this. And as I mentioned, Eskadar is from EcoJustice Ethiopia.
Hi, everyone. I hope you can hear me okay. My name is Skadar Augucho. and I serve as the founder and executive director of EcoJustice Ethiopia. And I'm also a very proud member of GAIA Africa, and I'm very happy to be part of GAIA Africa's delegation to INC 5.2, working towards a strong and justice-centered global plastics treaty. One key priority I urge African journalists to amplify in their coverage is the full life cycle approach to plastics. Particularly, I encourage you to focus on the upstream extraction and downstream waste management phases. In my country, Ethiopia, we are witnessing a growing surge in petrochemical infrastructure linked to plastic production, yet local communities face a serious gap in environmental oversight and public health protection. This is where harm begins and where justice must be rooted. At the same time, those managing the consequences, especially the informal waste pickers, are often excluded from decision making and left without recognition, dignity, or a fair working condition. And these workers are at the front line of environmental stewardship, yet they face daily exposure to toxic materials with limited access to safety or social support. So that's why we are calling on our African media network to highlight this dimension in their reporting. I believe a just transition means ensuring that waste speakers are protected, empowered, and included in shaping the treaty outcomes. So your coverage can connect these grassroots resilience realities to the global policy shifts and help redefine who leads Africa's climate future. I really thank you for using your platforms to uplift justice-centered narratives at INC 5.2. And I say, let's make Africa's voice unmistakably bold. Thank you very much. And I look forward to engaging with you in the future.
Great. It was lovely to hear from Eskada as well. So thank you all so much, our speakers, for sharing your priorities and the things that need coverage or better coverage or more coverage or stronger coverage going into INC 5.2. Absolutely amazing perspective. So very much appreciation for all of you. It's almost like we've assembled like the policy dream team together, sharing all of these priorities. So we are almost at time. So I would just ask for all of you to please indulge us for maybe 10 to 15 minutes, just so that we can also dive in a little bit more to some of the plans that we have, as well as answer some of these questions. We've got in some really good questions in so far, and forgive us if we don't get through all of them. We will perhaps have them answered as part of the post webinar pack and shared with everyone. But yeah, and speaking of another member of the policy dream team, I want to hand over now to our communications lead, Carissa Mans. So Carissa is gonna take us through some of the an overview of some of the communications and media activities, as well as some opportunities coming up at INC 5.2. So Carissa, over to you.
Thank you so much, everybody. And this section will be very quick, but just to give you a rundown of some media opportunities that you can reach out to us about when we're in Geneva. So the main thing that we're punting is for people to sign up to our journalist network if you're not part of our journalist network already. And so as part of this, we'll be sharing daily live recaps from Geneva. So types of content you can expect is written and video content, media releases, and updates from our movements on all of the mobilization efforts that are happening on the ground. And we'll be sharing a form in the chat for you to actually sign up for the network. And then today we've had some amazing speakers, and we just want to say that if you ever want to reach out for interviews with our African leaders leading the plastic pollution, anti-plastic pollution movement, with us in Geneva, we'll have over 30 members, GAIA Africa members with us. And if you'd like to reach out to them for any interviews, you can reach out to us, anyone on the team. But as part of this recap email, we're going to be sharing some contact details that you can reach out to myself. on. And then something else that we're also punting is in this time, our movement is writing opinion pieces and personal reflections on the treaty process. And so we're really asking you to amplify these stories. We share it on the mailing list, the Africa Journalist mailing list. So you can find new op-eds penned by our movement. And also our global teams, GAIA Global and the BFFP Break Free from Plastic movement has developed some amazing press kits that you can have a look at with key messages, highlighting all of the priorities, like we've shared on this call, but it's just your one-on-one guide for you to look through some stuff really quickly, and we'll be sharing that as well. And lastly, just encouraging you to follow us on our Instagram, Facebook pages and other social media platforms. We also have a really cool podcast where we've been releasing treaty-related content that you can check out. We have some newer episodes as well. And then also just encouraging you to follow our web pages. We have a GAIA Treaty web page and a Break Free from Plastic page as well. But I'll stop there and hand it back to Nathan to take us through the last segment.
Great. Thank you so much, Carissa, for giving us the overview as well as the different opportunities that await our friends from the media as we embark on this INC 5.2 journey. So we now are at a Q&A session. So we've received quite a few questions. So we may not be able to get through all of them, but we will go through some of them. Elvira, you had your hand up first, so I'll just maybe start off with your question that you put in the chat. So Elvira's question is, in Africa especially, policies are hindered by the lack of willingness to implement treaties and policies. Are governments included in the treaty processes? How do we ensure the implementation of the resolutions of the treaty? How can we get African governments to tap into the urgency of plastic waste issues in African countries? So I'm not sure who from our dream team wants to take this on. Perhaps I should just close my eyes and pick somebody. Marissa, go ahead.
Sure. Just wanted to give others the opportunity. Thank you so much, Elvira, for that question. It's most definitely, this is as they keep saying, a member state-led process. So governments are leading in terms of the mandate for this treaty and what the outcomes could be, with us as civil society present as observers in this space. So we don't generally make any interventions or participate directly in the negotiations. This is very much governments negotiating a treaty with the support of civil society presence in this space. In terms of urgency, Africa has been responding to this treaty with urgency and has been leading the way for a very long time now. If you will recall, it was Rwanda and Peru that started the calls for a plastics treaty. So very much being an Africa or Global South-led initiative, and that has now culminated in 54 countries speaking with one voice in the context of the plastics treaty with a united voice. So it is very much within the grasp of African governments right now.
Thank you, Marissa. And just before I move on to the next question, is there any of our other speakers want to add anything to that question? Okay. If not, then I will move on to the next question. I note your hand, John. I'll come to you after we've gone through a question from Charles and then Michael. So Charles, your question is, I understand the ambitious timeline for negotiation and adoption of the treaty was set for mid-2025. Why is the delays, and is there any hope for the adoption of the instrument this year? So does anybody want to have a go at that question? Jacob, go for it.
Thank you very much, Niven, and thank you very much for the question. The the reason, and I believe, and many of my colleagues will agree, why we've had a delay in the process is because, like Marissa said in her presentation, somewhere during INC-2, we had a very small group of countries, of member states, try to block the process and ensure that we don't get to this point. And when we say try to block the process, what does that look like? They try to ensure that decisions that had been taken during an open-ended working group that was held in Dakar in early 2022 could be reopened, and the specific decision or the specific issue that they wanted reopened will allow member countries to come to an agreement on this treaty based on consensus. And that means that if everybody doesn't agree, essentially means nothing is agreed. So even if one member state says that a word like "and" or A&D should not be in the treaty, it means that the process has to be halted for that person to be convinced before we move ahead. And like Marissa said, one of the key things we want to see in this process is to ensure that every country retains a right to vote. What that looks like is that if there's a decision that has been made, there has to be a threshold of people present and voting to be able to make that decision, so that we don't have any one country who doesn't want to see progress of the treaty hold us back. And what that looks like practically is for the rules of procedure to include an option of voting if there is no consensus. So as a coalition of GAIA members in Africa, what we're saying is that consensus is great, and that should be the first option. However, if member states are unable to reach a consensus, there must be the option to vote. And that is how member states can retain their sovereignty in the decision-making process. If all things go well, specifically at INC 5.2, seeing the momentum that we had in Busan somewhere late last year in November and December, and majority of the countries, 100 plus, called for high ambition and dedicated progress in making sure this treaty comes back. If we're able to keep up the momentum and keep up the pressure and ensure that those 100 plus countries are able to have their way and keep aside the few member states, very few handful member states who are trying to block the process, we are very hopeful that we will achieve a treaty and we will have a legally binding instrument by the time we leave Geneva, hopefully in August 15th. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jacob, for your response to that question. Our next question is from Michael. So Michael's question is, how can the Global Plastics Treaty ensure a fair transition for Africa, balancing plastic reduction with implementation support? So perhaps I could pass this on to one of our other speakers, maybe Dorothy. Could you maybe have a go and we could get somebody else to add to it?
All right. So, in my understanding, how do we balance reduction and implementation? I guess that's the question that we're contemplating now. The thing is, we are alive to the fact that, Africa is also talking about some countries in Africa not supporting reduction, because I have had arguments that, we are supporting 40,000 employments, things like that. But we at some point we have to come to a realization, and it's normally also a question of ethics. Are we going to continue to produce and then harm the population generally? Because production doesn't just harm even those 40,000 people, it harms all other people who come into contact with these plastics because also of the chemical concern. Or are we going to reduce the production and only minimize it to a certain group or criteria that will be agreed by the parties and only focus on that while reducing? I also have to mention that when we conduct studies, and this have been done globally, we see that food packaging is taking a whole chunk of about 40% of the plastics. And therefore, we are saying, even if we're talking about reduction, there's a clear path for us that is easy, that is implementable. We can look at the food sector and reduce 40% of plastics without necessarily causing any harm. And we know now And we've always known this because of our African values, that we have alternatives that are present. We have reuse systems, we have repurposing, that's what we do most of the time, and we have our indigenous knowledge. And so I believe that yes, we can reduce, especially in those sectors that are absolutely not necessary, that we are producing single-use plastics and where we have alternatives. And this is how it will help us to implement the treaty without necessarily, harming anybody. At some point, we have to make a valid decision based on what is good for us as opposed to what is good financially. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dorothy. We did have a hand up, John, but I think John's left the call. So we just have two questions left. So perhaps we could try and wrap up those two questions in the next 6 minutes so we could end by 15 minutes past the hour. So the next question is, and also thank you, Rico, for answering the question in the chat that Sephora posed. So the next question is, what role do regional bodies like the AU, EAC, SADC, and ECOWAS play in driving efforts to reduce plastic production at the upstream level? So I'm not sure who from our panel maybe wants to have a go at this. Maybe one of the speakers that hasn't responded to any of the... Mohammed, maybe I could throw this to you.
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you very much for that question. It is a very important question. So let's break it down into two parts. The first part is there's a very important sort of not only policy, but more of formulating positions of the countries and reinforcing them. So these regional bodies play a very important role in further cementing and solidifying the commitments that countries are putting together. So even though that these negotiations happen under the United Nations sort of system in a way through UNEP and through the United Nations Environment Assembly, it is very important that through the African Union, for instance, that we have a consolidated position as well that reinforces the African group's position overall on how to tackle the plastics life cycle. This better consolidates African efforts generally and pushes for more ambition, gives a better mandate to the negotiators. That's one side of the story and one side of the coin. The other side that is probably not as utilized is the creation of supporting working groups of experts, of researchers, of academics that can provide the sort of science, that sort of locally led, African-led science and policy that can reinforce and support the work of the negotiators that are negotiating on behalf of Africa. This can be very influential. However, this is probably an area that has not been well explored yet, neither from the sub-regional groups or the overall regional groups like the AU. So I guess these are the two areas to look at. There is potential for us to look further on this, probably not being optimized to the best yet.
Thank you very much, Mohammed, for your response. And our last question is, how can African countries secure strong commitments on plastic reduction and equitable access to finance and technology during INC 5.2 to effectively address plastic pollution across the continent? So perhaps, Nadine, maybe I could pass this question on to you.
Thank you. And there are much more expert individuals on this call, but I will sort of give you my sort of short answer to this is we need a dedicated fund. And we need to, as I said in my intervention, not repeat the mistakes of prior conventions and prior MEAs. So the simple short answer for everyone is we need a robust financial architecture that includes a dedicated fund, and that fund should have access for civil society observers, including and not limited to NGOs, but actual civil society observers. And lastly, and I think most importantly, is that it should not be based on concessions or which would ridden our countries with debt, but it should be grant-based funding to be able to solve the problems, not only of legacy plastic that we have to endure, but to be able to transition justly our industries, and particularly with a particular focus on waste pickers.
All right, fantastic. Thank you, Nadine. And with that, we have come to the end of our questions. Thank you all for staying with us for the extra minutes. We've been able to retain most of the participants. So a huge thank you to everyone for joining us here today. It was quite an insightful session. And this is just the starting point, I guess. So let's hope to stay engaged and communicating with each other over the next few weeks as INC 5.2 happens. I'd like to thank all of our spokespeople that were here today. So just as a reminder, we had Rico from South Africa, Mohammed from Egypt, Dorothy from Kenya, Jacob from Ghana, Sarah from Nigeria, Nadine from Egypt, and Eskeda from Ethiopia. Should you wish to get in contact with any of them, please do reach out to our comms team. So perhaps we'll just put in the details here and then we can connect you directly with the spokesperson that you'd like to be in touch with. But also do join us on this journey of INC 5.2. So much appreciation to everyone for joining today. Thank you, Marissa and Carissa, for your presentations from our team side. Thank you to our interpreters. And yeah, thank you all for joining, and I hope you have a good rest of your evening.
Thank
Take
you
care,
so
everyone.
much. And thank you, Niven, for
Thank you
facilitating.
to Niven for hosting us.
Bye, everyone.
Bye bye. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.